Debbie distanced herself from the man quickly. When she turned around to see who the man was, he leaped behind her again. It was beginning to frustrate her. But the man's game had only just begun. The same routine was repeated a couple more times, and finally, Debbie could no longer hold back her annoyance. She shouted, "Are you here to fight, or are you just making fun of me? Be a man and fight with me, face to face." The amused man failed to suppress a snort. Upon hearing him, Debbie was so shocked that she felt goosebumps on her arms. Not Carlos Huo again, she thought and lamented. Just as her shoulders sagged, indicating that she had dropped her guard, a familiar figure appeared in front of her from behind. Deep inside, she had wished for her suspicion to be wrong. The disdain hanging on his face stung Debbie. Ignoring the fact that she was no match for him in kung fu, she clenched her fists and challenged him, "Fight me or leave," but that only threw him in a fit of laughter. "Stop laughing like an idiot," she demanded. Resting both hands in his pockets, Carlos said casually, "Fight you? You're too weak to fight me. Too naive for her own good." Debbie fell for another one of his attempts to provoke her. Without another word, she raised her fist and swung it towards his face. Effortlessly, Carlos dodged the punch and continued, My, how rude of you. At this rate, no man will want to have you as a girlfriend." But she was no longer listening. Debbie tried her best to attack Carlos, but her efforts were futile. "That is none of your business," she yelled, fuming with madness. "Even if you were the only man in the world, you'd never have me," she snapped back. "Really?" he asked, amused. His eyes darkened whilst he was mulling over her words. "I see," he said, nodding slightly. "So you want me to have you." With that, he gave her a suggestive grin which quickly turned her face red. Not only is he a bastard, but he's also a womanizer. Ugh, how I wish I could just beat him up, she thought while glaring at him. When she was about to attack him again, the phone in his pocket began to ring. It was probably Emmett looking for him. Ignoring his ringing phone, Carlos grabbed her fist with his palm and pushed her against the wall. With a dangerous smile in place on his face, he leaned close to her. As he used his free hand to reach into his pocket and dismiss the call, the other one continued to grab her wrist above her head. While she was still trapped against her wishes, he had his right knee between her legs and his upper body pressed against her. No matter how much Debbie tried, she was unable to move at all. He lowered his head, and now his face was mere inches away from hers. The lady whose heart just skipped a beat could feel his heavy breathing. It elicited a ticklish sensation within her which she did not appreciate. As her other hand was free from his grip, her first instinct was to scratch the ticklish sensation on her neck away, but it was also immediately pulled up above her head by his. No amount of wriggling away worked against his strength. She was rendered speechless. "Right now, I have a score to settle with you," he said, narrowing his eyes. "The last time we were this close, you kneed me in the crotch. What if that stun of yours made me impotent?"
No erection anymore whatsoever.
He paused before continuing, "You'll have to take responsibility for it." By some stroke of unfortunate luck, Emmett ended up arriving just in time to hear and be shocked by what his boss said. The client who Carlos was supposed to meet this evening was getting impatient in the club. Emmett tried to call Carlos a couple of times, but he did not answer. Emmett quickly began to worry. Therefore, he went out of the club to search for his boss. For a long time, he had sought for Carlos in nearby streets, thinking that perhaps his boss had been caught up with finding a parking space. But then he had suddenly remembered Debbie. Although it was a long shot, he went back to where they had found her in hopes of finding his boss. To his surprise, his boss was indeed with the young lady, flirting. Watching them from a distance felt surreal. Wow, Emmett thought deeply. I didn't expect him to be so risque with Debbie, and to think that he has no idea that she's actually his wife. How astonishing it is that he might really have a thing for her. Regardless whether she is Mrs. Huo or not, it seems that they are destined to be together. Much to Debbie's displeasure, she blushed in embarrassment. If she was being honest, no one had ever flirted with her like this in the past. Carlos was the first one, and now she was at a loss for words. The man was indeed a womanizer, she thought, and somehow she felt upset about it. Taking a deep breath, she threatened, "Let go of me, otherwise, I'll cry out for help." "Whatever makes you happy," Carlos answered indifferently. Just when Debbie was about to scream at the top of her lungs, she spotted Emmett, who was standing not so far away. "Finally, someone who can save me from this hell," Debbie thought gleefully, and then she called out to him, "Emmett, come here and help me. Your boss is in heat." Startled, Emmett did not know what to do when he was suddenly dragged into the mess. So he did what first came to his mind and made a run for it, yelling, "I saw nothing." The last thing he wanted to do was get on the wrong side of his boss. It was why he could not disobey his orders to go ahead and walk to the club a while ago, and it was still the same reason why he did not have the courage to stand up to Carlos when Debbie asked for his help. Moreover, this was a family matter. As an outsider, he did not think that it was his place to interfere. "Mrs. Huo, I'm sorry, you'll have to take care of yourself," Emmett thought ruefully, and then he fled. "Hey, Emmett," Debbie yelled after the man, but he quickly disappeared from view. Even with a public toilet near the alley where they were currently situated, no one else seemed to have passed by them. That only meant there was no one coming to save her. Cursing under her breath, Debbie finally looked the overpowering man in the eye. "Damn it, what else can I do? I guess for now, I should just admit my defeat," she thought. So she tried her best to hold back her anger and put on a fake smile. "Mr. Huo, a generous man like you would forgive me, right?" Debbie said in a coy voice. "After all, I'm just a weak girl." With a raised eyebrow and a sarcastic smile, Carlos eyed her from head to toe and answered, "You? A weak girl?" He let out a derisive laugh. "Are you kidding me? On the outside, she can barely be counted as a girl," Carlos thought, his eyes lingering on her body. "She doesn't even have a big chest. As for her ass, it is not that hot either." Despite his observations, though, Carlos flashed an evil smile and came up with an impulsive idea. Releasing one of her arms, he slid his hand behind her and pinched her ass. Debbie stood in silence, her mouth agape at Carlos' boldness. What just happened? After what felt like decades, the young lady finally gathered her thoughts. "Carlos Huo," Debbie yelled in her mind. "How dare you take advantage of me? I swear, I will kill you." Even after using her full strength, which was boosted with anger, Debbie was disappointed to find out that she still could not free her arm from his grip. Flustered, she said through gritted teeth, "You jerk!" The smile on his face slowly waned. He curled his lips while letting go of her. Adjusting his suit, he became poker-faced again. "Stay away from me from now on," he demanded coldly and turned away. "I'm a married man. I shouldn't have flirted with another girl," he thought grimly, wiping his mouth as though he was disgusted with himself. When Debbie eventually met up with Christina, still visibly angry, the latter had already sung several songs. Only a few people had stopped to listen to her, and most passers-by just cast a glance at her before walking away. It was a tough stint trying to get people's attention. But singing was Kristen's passion, and she would do anything to gain a loyal audience. When she saw Debbie return after having disappeared for about half an hour, Christina let out a sigh of relief. She was grateful that Debbie accompanied her. After the sun was finished, only one person put $5 in the box in front of them. The two ladies shared an unsatisfied look. Actually, Christina was a good singer. After all, the reason why Debbie and she became close was that they both loved singing. Although Debbie had a better voice, she had never been trained before. As a result of her lack of practice, Debbie was therefore not as skilled in singing as she wanted to be. Debbie heaved a long sigh of relief. It was time for her to focus and forget about her annoying husband. Picking up the guitar, she began to sing. "I was doubling over. The load on my shoulders was a weight I carried with me every day." In the Orchid Private Club, a waiter pushed the door of a private booth and held it open for Carlos. Right behind him, Emmett followed suit. The man was sweating nervously. They were running late, and it was not like they had a good reason. The client was throwing a tantrum as it was 10 minutes past the agreed time of their meeting. On seeing Carlos, however, he immediately put on a flattering smile and greeted, "Mr. Huo, you are finally here." The man reached out to shake hands with Carlos, but the latter merely threw a cold look at his hand, walked past him, and sat on the couch. When the man saw Carlos' infamous arrogance firsthand, his face turned sour. But he did not say anything to show his true feelings. He approached Carlos and offered, "Mr. Huo, allow me to pour you a glass of wine." Before he could do anything, Emmett reached out to hold the bottle and said, "Sorry, Mr. Lee. Mr. Huo has delicate digestion and cannot drink alcohol." Embarrassment was written all over the man's face. It was Carlos who took the initiative to seek partnership with him. But why was he acting so arrogant, as if he were his boss? Emitting arrogance, Carlos refused to grab the drink. Marvin Lee, however, didn't dare to force him, feeling his menacing aura. He could only force an awkward smile and gave him the contract he had prepared. While Carlos was reading the contract, his brows furrowed. After a couple of minutes, he stood up and threw the contract on the table. "I won't sign the contract," he said coldly. After hearing this, Marvin Lee got anxious and argued in an instant. "Mr. Huo, as per our last conversation, you agreed to..." However, even before he could continue, Carlos interrupted him in an icy tone. "Marvin Lee, do you think I'm that stupid? The content of this contract is clear to me. Did you really think that I would fall into your trap?" Surprised by Carlos' words, he started having cold sweat. With a pale face, Marvin Lee thought to himself, did he find out the trap hidden in the clauses? How's that even possible? Without a word, Carlos walked towards the door. In an instant, Emmett pulled the door open for him. Looking at Carlos' back as he took his leave, Marvin Lee exclaimed, "Mr. Huo, please wait. This is only a misunderstanding." He tried to follow behind Carlos in an attempt to make him stay. On the other hand, Carlos ignored his plea and left without looking back. He went to the underground park and stopped halfway as he heard an alluring sound. Immediately, he changed his direction and walked towards the entrance of the club. Under a big tree, about several hundred meters away from the Orchid Private Club, a girl was seen singing a beautiful, sad song. "Just one last dance, before we say goodbye." Her song continued playing. When Emmett recognized the singer, he widened his eyes to plates, his jaw slack. Since when did Mrs. Huo start to make a living as a street singer? He thought. When Marvin Lee noticed that Carlos seemed to be interested in the female singer, he thought he had a chance to fawn on him. He took out a thick wad of notes from his briefcase and threw it into the iron box in front of Debbie. After seeing the amount of money he just threw, Debbie stopped singing, shocked by the impressive amount of thousands of dollars. Everyone looked at Marvin Lee, who put on a proud smile and demanded in an arrogant tone, "Sing a song for our Mr. Huo. If you can make him smile, I'll give you more money." Hearing his words made her fuming mad. The fat man's words came as an insult for her. Casting a quick burning glare at her so-called husband, she immediately straightened herself and flashed a sweet smile. "Sure, I'll be glad to offer Mr. Huo a song. I hope you enjoy it." On the other hand, in the gathered crowd, some recognized Carlos and couldn't help but go berserk over his handsome face. Noticing Debbie's beaming eyes, Carlos suddenly felt bad over Marvin Lee's groundless request. He then uttered, "No need to." Even before he could turn her down, she started strumming her guitar and singing a song. Skipping the first part of the song, she immediately went to the climax and hit the notes. Her song went, "I pray your brakes go out running down a hill. I pray a flower pot falls from a windowsill and knocks you in the head like I'd like to. I pray your birthday comes and nobody calls. I pray you are flying high when your engine stalls. I pray all your dreams never come true." Hearing the end of her song, the crowd became silent and stole glances at the handsome man, waiting to see his response. Surprised, Marvin Lee hadn't expected Debbie to sing such a song. He was so scared, thinking he had done a stupid thing. "Damn bitch, what is she singing? Oh man, I'm screwed," he thought, wiping the cold sweat off his forehead. Without giving a care nor caring to stop, Debbie continued singing her song for Carlos. She didn't mind irritating the man in front of her. At the same time, Carlos lowered his head and rubbed his arching brow. Her song came as a surprise. Without raising his head, he pointed to Debbie and demanded, "Since she can swim, you, Emmett Zhong, dig a hole and bury her alive." Carlos felt his heart beating so fast, not because he was flattered, but because his anger was slowly filling the brim of his patience. His gut feeling was telling him that if he didn't kill this girl now, he would someday die of anger because of her. Carlos' words made the crowd surprised. "What? Bury her alive?" were the words heard from the crowd. Everyone was startled from his sudden reply. If it were somebody else who had said those words, everybody would think that it was a joke. However, it was Carlos speaking, and he was known as a man of his word. Noticing a group of strong, terrifying bodyguards heading towards Carlos, the crowd immediately dispersed in an uproar. Emmett panicked, not knowing what to do. "I guess I should tell him the truth now before things get worse. Otherwise, he will definitely regret his decision today." He thought to himself and made a decision. Leaning towards his ears, Emmett whispered to his boss, "Mr. Huo, this girl, whom you just asked us to bury, is Debbie Nian." His words confused Carlos. He looked at Emmett as if looking at an idiot. What is wrong with him? He's been acting really weird recently, Carlos thought. Do I not know her name? Do I need him to remind me of that? Debbie realized that Carlos' words weren't a joke. She immediately packed her guitar and pulled Christina's wrist, who was still standing there. She decided to run away as fast as she could. Before she took her leave, she grabbed the money in her iron box. Hearing Emmett revealing her real identity to Carlos, she immediately went ahead. As the group of bodyguards slowly approached them, Emmett cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Huo, your wife's name is also Debbie Nian. What does it have to do with?" Carlos said and halted. Even before he could utter the words "my wife," his face changed from one expression to another. The man who just planned to bury Debbie seemed to be trapped in a daze after learning about her identity. Carlos' facial expression changed from indifferent to stunned, then shocked. Never had Emmett seen so many expressions on his boss face before. He was both amused and frightened, knowing Carlos would not spare him this time. Suddenly, Debbie stopped after a few strides. Since her identity had already been revealed, she released Christina's wrist, turned around and went back to Carlos. With a fierce face, she said, "I dumped you, Carlos Huo. Remember to sign the divorce agreement." She then turned her back and continued walking with Christina. With a shaking hand, Carlos pointed to Debbie's retreating figure. His face couldn't be painted. He was too angry to utter even a single word. The girl who he had called a slut and ordered to be buried alive was his wife? This thought kept on playing on his puzzled mind. Because of this, for quite some time, Carlos remained in a daze. He still couldn't believe what had just happened, until finally he came back to his senses. Immediately, he could only think of kicking Emmett as hard as he could on his leg. Emmett wailed mournfully. He had known it. He had known this would all come to no good end for him. "What were you doing? Why didn't you say so earlier?" Carlos exclaimed in anger. After saying that, he trotted towards his Bentley. As he got inside, he quickly pressed on the accelerator and left that place. When the car approached Emmett, he reduced the speed, rolled down the car window and ordered, "You better go to a construction site and carry bricks tomorrow. I don't want to see your face in the coming year." With a mixture of anger and disbelief, he sped up and left Emmett behind. Hearing his boss' words, Emmett suddenly forgot the excruciating pain on his leg. Watching the guitar container and iron box left by Debbie and Christina, he was at a loss whether to laugh or to cry. Meanwhile, Debbie and Christina stopped and sat on a bench at the roadside after running a long way. They gasped for breaths, unable to talk, transforming moments into memories. Christina had been startled by Carlos' presence and hadn't heard what Emmett had told him. There were only 3 words that kept on repeating in her mind. "Bury her alive." The very thought made Christina tremble with fear. She grabbed Debbie's hand and stammered, "Tomboy, hurry, take the money and run as far as you can. I do not wish to see you buried alive." Her innocence made Debbie puzzled whether to laugh or get worried. All along, Christina knew Debbie had offended Carlos several times. She also knew that he would, by no means, let her go that easily. Since he now knows who I am positive that he will sign the divorce papers soon. He won't have to bury me alive anymore, Debbie thought. Otherwise, how will he be able to divorce me if I am nowhere to be found? Without taking into consideration how easy it would be for Carlos, she didn't realize that he would no longer need to divorce her if she were buried alive. Automatically, he would be single again in that case. He won't do that. Rest assured. He is not a mean man, she assured Christina. Patting her hand in an attempt to comfort her friend, Debbie wondered what could happen after today's incident. Thinking about this and Carlos' cold eyes, she couldn't help but shiver in fear. Time went by as they continued to rest. Finally, they decided to go back to the dormitory and hailed a taxi. Just as Debbie was about to get in, her phone rang. It was from Philip. "Hello, Philip," Debbie greeted on the phone. "What, now?" Narrowing her eyes, she said, "Okay, got it. I'll be there as soon as I can." After hanging up the call, she took a much-needed deep breath. Ever since she had given Philip the divorce papers, she had been staying in the dorm. There was no reason for her to live in the villa anymore. Yet a moment ago, she had received Philip's call and he had asked her to go back there. Unaware of the purpose behind his request, she became a bit worried. "Christina," Debbie began, turning to look at her. "I'm sorry you have to go back to school alone. I need to go back home." "What?" Christina asked in confusion. "Is there something wrong?" Concern was written all over her face. As much as Debbie wanted to share the truth, she felt it would be better to keep this to herself. Shaking her head, Debbie answered, "No, don't worry. I'll see you tomorrow." "All right then," Christina said with a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "Goodbye." A bit grateful that she did not have to answer any more questions, Debbie waited for her friend to get into the taxi they had just hailed and leave before she hailed another one for herself. While heading to the East City villa, she was in a rather nervous state. Did Carlos already agree to sign the divorce papers? She thought. If he did, Debbie wondered why she still had to make the trip back there. Upon reaching her destination, she paid the fare and got out of the taxi. Then, she stood on the spot while the taxi drove away and stared at the villa lit with more lights than she could count. Her eyes were filled with worry. Usually, there were only 3 people including her in the villa. Accompanying her were the servant and the steward, who were Julie Liu and Philip respectively. It was past 10 o'clock in the evening now. Neither Julie Liu nor Philip would typically stay overnight in the villa, yet it seemed like there were still people at home. There was only one explanation for Philip to stay so late. Carlos was at home. The young lady took a deep breath, opened the entrance door gently, and sneaked into the living room. There was no point in delaying her arrival. Philip's voice could be vaguely heard, and as she peered into the room, 2 men came into view. With a domineering aura, Carlos was sitting on the couch. The man did not appear like he was in a good mood. While staying hidden, Debbie considered walking out of the house, but her feet did not move and she had her eyes fixed on Carlos. His eyes were shut while he was listening to Philip's report regarding her personal information and recent activities. She ranked the last in high school, Philip said, carefully observing his boss' reaction, and she failed the college entrance exam. As per your request, I've arranged her application to study in the finance department of Economics and Management School of Y City University. She is currently a junior student. Noticing Debbie in the doorway, Philip gave her a sympathetic look. Carlos, on the other hand, did not even open his eyes. It was as though he hadn't heard the door open earlier. Deep in thought, the seemingly unaware man tapped the wooden armrest of the couch. What did she do in the university? Carlos interrupted Philip's report, his voice low and attractive at the same time. Clasping her hands together, Debbie quietly begged Philip not to throw her under the bus. The doe-eyed lady waited for him to make a choice. After having spent 3 years serving her, Philip believed that she was a good girl, and so he hesitated to answer the man in front of him. Continue, Carlos demanded. His voice was so cold and authoritative that it made the other 2 people in the room shudder at the same time. The steward shook his head in defeat, as though he were saying, "Kid, I can't help you this time. Only God can help you now." Then, to Debbie's horror, Philip began recounting everything she had done in the past 3 years. If Carlos were not there, Debbie would give the steward a sarcastic thumbs up and praise him by saying, "You'd definitely make a successful spy if it were in the wartime. The dean of the university called me the other day. She was informed by someone that Mrs. Huo had formed a gang. She had gang fights and," after a short pause, he added, "and smashed a teacher's desk." When Debbie heard that someone had dared to tell the dean what she had done, the first person that came to her mind was her cousin, Gail. The memory of her own actions made her break out in a cold sweat. Biting her lower lip, she began to justify herself and thought, "Yes, I did smash the teacher's desk, but it wasn't my fault. Wait a minute." The lady folded her arms upon realizing something. "What's Carlos doing right now?" she thought furiously. "He's my husband. Why is he acting like my father all of a sudden?" "Debbie, don't be afraid of him." But before she could speak up, Carlos' authoritative voice echoed in the living room. "Enough! Clean a room for me," he instructed Philip. Finally, he opened his eyes and directly stared at the figure standing in the entrance. "Is Mr. Huo going to live here?" Philip wondered to himself. But even if he wants to live here, why does he not choose to stay in the same room with Mrs. Huo? Despite his burning questions, Philip did not dare to ask Carlos. "Yes, Mr. Huo," he said promptly, and went to the second floor so he could clean the biggest bedroom for his boss. When Debbie noticed Carlos' cold glare, her heart skipped a beat. Like a child, she gripped her shirt tightly and lowered her head to avoid looking Carlos in the eye. "This is really weird," she thought. "I was not afraid of him before, but is he suddenly so scary now?" Contrary to her belief, Carlos was a sophisticated businessman who had dealt with various people multiple times in the past. The man was used to intimidating people, and at times he did not even need to utter a single word. No wonder the young lady was scared to death. "Come." Trapped in a trance, Debbie immediately obeyed his order without hesitation. Then, she stopped 3 meters away from him. "What should I do? Is he mad at me after knowing what I've done? Will he sign the divorce papers now? Or will he ask his men to bury me again? Should I run away now? I don't want to die." A myriad of thoughts flooded her mind. Casting an indifferent glance at the girl whose face was as pale as a corpse, Carlos managed to look expressionless despite his amusement. "I thought you weren't afraid of anything. You've provoked me so many times. You even sang a song to curse me. Why do you not dare to raise your head now?" He thought, "I'll move in from today on. I forbid you to live in the dorm. You are to stay here once again," Carlos said coldly. His next words made her eyes widen. "I'll drive you to the university every morning." It was like Debbie had been thrown into a vat of ice water. "I won't have any freedom in the future. I need to do something about this," she thought defiantly, raising her head as she prepared to state her arguments. Before she could speak, however, Carlos opened his mouth first. "Do you not agree?" The fury in her eyes made the man become sterner, his voice as cold as ice. "I can let go of her past deeds," he thought, "because I didn't know she is my wife back then." The corner of his mouth twitched. "But it's a different case now. I won't let her live like this anymore. Bad grades? No problem. I will teach her myself. Acting like a tomboy? Fine. I'll teach her how to be a soft girl," he swore to himself. Meanwhile, Debbie could not help but tremble on seeing his cold eyes. "Oh man, I can see it now. He is Carlos Huo, the rich and powerful Mr. President. Killing a person like me is as easy as killing an ant," she thought, her eyes glistening with fear. The man was waiting for her to respond. "Calm down, Debbie Nian. You can't afford to offend him," Debbie consoled herself. Shaking her head, she did not say a word. Even though she did not agree with his decision, she did not have the courage to say it out. As for the divorce, she did not dare to mention it either. Even though he did not spell it out for her, his current demands made it clear already. Without a shred of doubt, Debbie knew that the man had no intention of divorcing her. Stealing a glance at the man in front of her, she shuddered again. It's only the start of autumn, but why do I feel so cold?
I'm freezing.
I wanted to divorce him because of my freedom. I want to pursue my happiness. And I could not have my happiness while I am in this marriage. But it seems that I have made a stupid move. I lifted a rock only to drop it on my own feet. I thought he hated me. It's not like I didn't notice his annoyance every time we met. So why does he not want to divorce me? Why? She shouted in her mind. When Debbie did not seem like she was going to say anything, Carlos stood up from the couch and went up the stairs. As soon as he entered his bedroom, Debbie heaved a long sigh of relief and wiped the cold sweat off her forehead. Finally, in control of her emotions again, she gathered her thoughts and tried to understand his demands. He will drive me to school every day? She thought, frowning. What the hell? What should I do now? Throwing herself on the couch, Debbie tried to figure out a way to deal with the present situation. After lying down properly, she took out her phone from her pocket and searched for information about her dear husband. But when she typed Carlos Huo in the search bar, no related information came up at all. In such a society with an advanced information network, how did Carlos keep his information a secret from the public? It was a mystery which bothered Debbie. As the saying went, know your enemy, know yourself. She wanted to learn more about her husband, but with her online search ending in vain, she was stuck. Should she just talk to him instead? But as soon as the thought appeared in Debbie's mind, she quickly dismissed it. The man did not know how to listen to her. It would be just another futile attempt. Sighing, the young lady continued to ponder. I've been so stupid. I should have inquired Philip about Carlos more before. If I did, I wouldn't have had the audacity to cross him. Alas, it's too late now. What else can I do? Debbie thought, beating herself up over her ignorance. Now that she was seeing things in a different light, she really regretted having sung the song that evening to offend him. Debbie Nian, why did you have to provoke him again and again? You lifted a rock only to drop it on your own feet. She berated herself. Slapping a palm on her forehead in resentment, she then stood up. Tomorrow morning was going to be tough for her. When she went to the second floor, she stole a glance at the closed door of Carlos' bedroom. As soon as she was certain that it was not going to burst open at any minute, she sneaked into hers and closed the door as gently as possible. All night long, she tossed around in her bed. Her worries did not leave her alone at all. The next morning, she got up half an hour earlier than usual. After readying herself, she went down the stairs with dark circles around her eyes. All she wanted was to leave the house without being noticed by Carlos. The previous evening, she had made up her mind. Since she could not divorce him right now, she just had to keep herself away from him as much as possible. It was her only solution until she could make the man sign the divorce papers. If she had to face him, she decided she would not provoke him again. After all, safety was now her first priority. When she reached the first floor, however, she saw the very same man she meant to avoid in the dining room. Without even looking at her, Carlos ate his breakfast. It was a bit strange seeing him in a black shirt instead of his usual business attire. Debbie, come eat, Julie said in a cheerful voice as she went to the kitchen. Before the servant could reappear with Debbie's breakfast, the young lady was already running to the entrance door. No need for that, Julie, she shouted hastily. I'm in a hurry. When did he get up? I didn't even hear him make any sound, she thought to herself. Stop, came a cold voice from behind her back. Almost as if on command, Debbie paused from changing her shoes. Her breath hitched when she heard him. She stammered, turning around. Until that moment, something never occurred to Debbie. What was she supposed to call him? Boss, Debbie thought. Sounds like I'm an employee of his. Honey, that would be disgusting. She scrunched her nose in revulsion. Sir, she said formally, trying to make an excuse. I have something urgent to finish, so I'll be leaving now. Well, actually I can call him Uncle. He's so strict with me that he reminds me of my father. But, Debbie thought, still trapped in her own musings, if I really call him Uncle, he will surely get irritated. The young lady refrained from voicing out her thoughts, for if she did, it would throw out her entire plan of not getting on the wrong side of her husband. But upon hearing Debbie call him sir, Carlos could not help but furrow his brows while saying nothing for a while. Gracefully, he wiped his lips with a napkin and said, "I'll drive you to the university after you have breakfast." He then opened his laptop, burying himself with his work. Once again, his walls were up. Although Debbie wanted to turn him down, she decided against speaking up. The young lady could already imagine how he would react if she insisted on going to the university on her own. She did not want to be frozen to death by his cold glare, nor did she want to be thrown into the sea or buried alive. Well, not again. In a slow and cautious manner, Debbie walked over to the expensive mahogany dining table and sat as far away from him as possible. There was no question about how good Julie was at cooking, but Debbie simply had no appetite at all. His presence made it difficult for her to enjoy her meal. While putting food into her mouth, she kept stealing glances at Carlos every now and then. It was like she was not anticipating the slightest sound coming from her to annoy him. By the time she finished her breakfast, her forehead was wet with sweat. The lady stared at her hands under the table. A stomachache this morning did not seem out of the question. When Carlos noticed that she was done, he stood up, picked up his briefcase from the couch, and headed towards the entrance. Sighing with profound resignation, Debbie grabbed her backpack and followed after him. When she got out of the house, there was a black car parked right before her. Something about the vehicle appeared to be very striking, but she could not quite point a finger at it. Through the car window, she saw that Carlos was sitting in the back seat. Groaning, she did not approach the car at once. Where should she sit? Next to him in the back seat? The mere prospect of being close to him sent shivers down her spine. No, she thought stubbornly. I do not want to die out of fright. But maybe I can sit in the passenger seat. The young lady was too focused on staying away from Carlos to notice he was running out of patience. I have no time to wait for you, he stated from inside the car. The harshness in his voice brought Debbie back to her senses. Darting towards the car, she opened the door of the passenger seat. To her disappointment, however, it was already occupied by Carlos' belongings. Left with no choice, she could only shut the door and sit behind with him. As Carlos was sitting on the left, she took the right side. Neither of them spoke another word while the car moved slowly. Casting a glance at Debbie from the car window, Philip noticed the girl lean against the car door, averting Carlos as if he were the plague. Sighing, he thought, Debbie used to be a cheerful and lively girl. Now that she's in front of Mr. Huo, she looks so cautious and reserved. She must be frightened of him. 20 minutes later, a black luxurious car stopped along the entrance of the Economics and Management School of Y City University. Seeing luxurious cars at the university was not anything out of the ordinary, as many of the students came from wealthy families. In fact, many students often took delight in parading their high status. However, the car that was parked in the entrance of the university was worth at least tens of millions of dollars. Who could own such an extravagant set of wheels? It was for this reason that it caught several people's attention. Thank you, sir. Goodbye, Debbie said hastily. As soon as the words left her mouth, she pushed the door open and ran as fast as she could. It looked so comical, as though she were being chased by some fierce animal. The moment the young lady emerged from the car, students in every direction began to gossip. Their curiosity was satiated by her appearance, but now they had more questions. She usually rides a BMW, and now she has a new car. This car is several times more expensive than her BMW. Suddenly, people were sharing their theories with one another. Although some students had families who could afford these luxury cars, there were many pretty girls in the university who were mistresses of rich men. That theory would have satisfied them, but that did not just make sense because it was Debbie. It was difficult to believe that she would ever be someone's mistress. Indeed, she had a pretty face, but the young lady did not act like a girl at all. No one could believe that there would be a rich man who would like to have a tomboy as his mistress. Tomboy, Jared exclaimed as he rubbed his eyes. Am I dreaming? Apparently, he was among the students who saw Debbie getting out of the black car. At first, his interest was innocent enough. It was a really nice car. All he knew was that Debbie came from a rich family and that her usual ride to school was a BMW which already cost millions of dollars. So Jared's curiosity was not about whether Debbie's family could afford it. More likely, he was curious about the type of man who would spend so much money on a car. It made him wonder who her father was, as he had not heard of a rich man whose surname was Nian. Simultaneously, he realized that Debbie had rarely spoken about her father. Now more than ever, he wanted to get to know the man with extravagant taste in cars. The car named Emperor was ZL Group's latest product, worth about tens of millions of dollars. Wait, Jared thought suddenly. As far as I recall, there are only 2 Emperor cars in Y City, and one of them belongs to Mr. Huo.
No.
Debbie and Mr. Huo. Jared did not even notice that he was casting a dirty look at his friend who was wearing white trousers and a gray coat. Upon examining her in a tactless manner, he concluded that she did not look like she had slept with Carlos the previous night. His suspicion was so obvious to Debbie that she did not even need to be a mind reader. Bak! Once she stood beside her dirty-minded friend, she slapped her hand on his back. The man yelped in pain and rubbed his sore back. The disapproving look on her face was enough to make him pause while looking too silly for his own good. Scowling at him, Debbie rolled her eyes in disbelief. How could Jared even think that she was a mistress? Why on earth would she even sleep with someone for money? Well, Debbie thought to herself, if sleeping with Mr. Huo means he would be kinder to me, I just might consider it. Because of her insistence on avoiding annoying her husband, the frightening and cold Mr. Huo, she did not stop to consider that using a different car might attract unwanted attention. Clenching her teeth, she quickly thought of a plausible cover-up. Don't take it the wrong way, she began to tell him. The car belongs to my family. Don't you know that I come from a rich and powerful family? By the end of her explanation, she tried to sound as proud as she could, which immediately convinced Jared. Shaking off all his reckless thoughts, Jared proceeded to the classroom with her. Every so often, she would catch him giving her an apologetic look. What was I thinking? How's it even possible for Tomboy to be someone's mistress? Jared scolded himself in his mind. Regardless of whether Debbie convinced him or not, the story of her riding an Emperor car to the university still spread like wildfire across the entire campus. As though she did not unwittingly draw enough attention to herself on her own, she became even more famous now. In the classroom, Debbie was leaning on her desk and pondering about Carlos and her marriage. For a while, she almost forgot about it, and when she did remember, she made sure that it did not affect her normal life. With the new complications that she was forced to deal with, it was going to be more difficult now than before. Making sure no one was looking, she allowed herself to seethe in secret. Her anger was not directed to anyone else, but herself. I thought I was brave enough, she thought, but the moment I was in front of him, I got cold feet and didn't know what to say. I didn't even dare to mention the whole divorce thing. What a coward I was. Frustrated, Debbie buried her head under her arms. If Carlos was unwilling to divorce her, was she going to have a stressful life from now on? I seduced Jared and made eyes at Emmett in front of Carlos on purpose. Everyone knows he hates that type of woman, so he should have been enraged by it. He should have signed the divorce papers last night. But why did he not do it? Oh God, I just cannot understand that man. While Debbie was internally caught up in her dilemma, Casey's voice rang in her ears and brought her back to earth. Hey guys, the cheerful lady said, tomorrow is Kristen's birthday. We're going to have a party in a bar tomorrow night. If you're coming with us, please go to Dixon to enter your name. Whenever there was an upcoming party or event, Dixon would be in charge of the head count of the people who were going to participate. After all, he was very meticulous about everything. It was a job for a perfectionist. So, at the mention of Christina's birthday, he had already asked who was going to come and take part in the occasion. Debbie, who was one of Christina's good friends, sat up straight as if she was going to make an announcement. Christina, you'll be 20 years old. Isn't that right? She inquired, making sure she was not mistaken even though she knew she couldn't be wrong. She knew the celebrant better than anybody else ever did. Christina took Debbie's arm and gently placed her cheek against her shoulder. Yes, that's right. I can't wait to celebrate my birthday. It's gonna be grand, she exclaimed in excitement. It was fortunate that nothing that would harm Debbie had happened last night. Otherwise, the celebrant would have paid no mind to her birthday and would show no interest in celebrating it. However, this did not mean that she did not have a hunch that something bad could have happened the night before. She was wondering how Debbie had managed to escape Carlos' wrath. But she knew she had better set it aside and just ask her friend in some private time later. Christina and Debbie were already having their own mini-celebration while holding each other's hands in excitement when Casey, who looked into a vanity mirror to fix her hair, rolled her eyes and snickered. You should stay away from that tomboy, Christina. You make it seem like she's your boyfriend. Just thinking about it gives me goosebumps. Christina, who actually genuinely loved the friendship she had with Debbie, cast Casey a challenging look and snapped back. You talk as if you didn't used to pester her like I do. She stroked her long, curly hair and thought, I should dye my hair like Debbie's. The colors look great on her. I'm sure it would look more vivid under the sun. She compared her hair to her friend's. Debbie put her arm around her friend's shoulders like a boy would and argued in her defense. Ladies, please do not quarrel over me. There's more to go around. What's our next class? Let's get to it. You really are meandering mindlessly, huh? There's no more class. We need to get lunch, Casey reminded her in a very sarcastic tone. With resignation, she shoved her mirror and books inside her bag and went ahead to the cafeteria. Debbie checked the time and found that Casey was right. It was almost 12 o'clock. Okay, she said. Let's go get our lunch then. She grabbed her bag and stood up from her seat. She led the way and the others followed. The group was leaving the classroom when a boy who was sitting in the first row raised his head. The boy named Gregory Song intensely observed Debbie's retreating figure, his eyes full of affection. He thought, May I take part in the party as well, Debbie? Another boy approached Gregory Song. Aren't you going to have lunch? The curious boy asked. Gregory Song immediately broke his contact with the group and packed his stuff, confirming, Yes, I'm coming with you. He flashed a friendly smile and left the classroom along with his friend. The day had passed and it was already time for Christina's 20th birthday party. Debbie and Cassie went to the mall and shopped. After buying their dear friend a few gifts, they went to the club venue that Christina had reserved for the party. There were more than a dozen students in the private booth. Some of them were even unfamiliar to Debbie. But soon after befriending each one, they all became close to the point that they could play truth or dare with each other. Whoever loses this round has to make out with the opposite sex for a minute, Casey announced. The boys, who were surrounded with beautiful girls, applauded this appeal. However, the girls blushed scarlet with shyness since some of them had never kissed a boy before. They agreed reluctantly with a tinge of excitement for new experiences. Unfortunately, Christina was the loser. I quit! The celebrant yelled and ran towards the door, trying to escape the situation that she was in. But before she could make her exit, a few students had already guarded and blocked the door. Nice try, birthday girl, but you must now choose a boy to kiss, Casey dictated. With her face looking like a tomato, Christina looked around and then pointed to a corner. Everyone averted their gaze to where the birthday girl was pointing and burst into laughter when they found out that Christina actually picked Debbie. Seriously? Christina Lynn, you always call me tomboy, but we both know I'm not a real boy. Get a hold of yourself, Debbie exclaimed, laughing over the matter herself. She was already a bit buzzed from the alcohol she had drunk and her cheeks were glowing with excitement. She looked quite appealing and attractive in that very moment. The birthday girl stomped her feet like a spoiled brat and pounced on her friend, yelling, Debbie, honey, why don't you give in to me? Debbie shrieked and dodged Christina's kiss. Hey, that doesn't count, Dixon complained as he pulled Christina away from Debbie. When the celebrant turned to him, she suddenly had an idea. Since you say that it doesn't count, then why don't you be the one to kiss me instead? Before he could react, Christina pulled him closer and kissed him on the lips. His eyes grew wider in shock. Whoa! The students cheered. They began to whistle, not expecting the birthday celebrant to be so spontaneous and brave. The affectionate kiss crowned the party fun. The minute the two people shared kissing was starting to feel like a year when Christina let go of Dixon and concluded it calmly like nothing unusual had happened. They both wiped their lips with their faces red as they could suddenly feel chemistry developing between them. How did that feel, Monitor? Were her lips soft and sweet? Debbie asked. She gave him a teasing smile. Dixon glanced at Casey, who had proposed the game, and said under his breath, "This was my first kiss." Christina rolled her eyes at the perfectionist's remark and retorted, "It was my first kiss too." She tried not to lose her calm. When Debbie noticed that the two were still blushing, she suggested, "Since you gave each other your first kisses, why don't you try to start dating from this day forward? It couldn't hurt to try." The crowd began to echo her idea. Jared even gave a loud whistle and yelled, "Be a man and do it! Make Christina your girlfriend! You coward! Do it, Dixon!" The crowd seconded. "Come on!" they shouted, urging him on. Everyone was excited to see how everything would unfold. The birthday celebrant covered her hot cheeks and sat back in her seat. "Don't make fun of us, you guys. It's my birthday, so you should all listen to me." Casey shook her head and said, "Yes, birthday girl, you're right. Saying yes to Dixon is a great idea. Besides, isn't this something we could call two happy events taking place one after the other?" It was their tradition to make fun of the birthday celebrant. They could all clearly recall that the last time, it was Debbie they had made fun of. Everyone burst into laughter at Casey's statement. The whole evening was pleasant and fun. Everyone had their fill of excitement and everyone had already shared their bounty. When the party came to a close, Debbie was already blackout drunk since she had downed the alcohol bottle after bottle. She drank more than she had ever done. She stood up from the couch and immediately staggered. Luckily, she was able to keep herself from falling and one of her classmates helped her up her feet. Not only was Debbie drunk, almost everyone was intoxicated. Jared shook his head and got even dizzier. "Who's still sober? Please," he asked in a drunk voice. "Take Debbie back to her house." A boy in the corner stood up with flushed cheeks and immediately volunteered. He was not drunk, he was just shy. He finally had a chance to be with the girl of his dreams alone. "I didn't drink too much, so I'll be the one to take her back," Gregory Song announced. He put his glass on the table and walked towards the drunk girl. Jared was a little surprised and taken aback that it was Gregory Song who took the initiative, but he immediately dismissed his suspicion and told the volunteer, "She lives in the East City Villa." Among all her classmates, Debbie only had 4 friends who knew her address: Jared, Casey, Christina, and Dixon. Upon hearing that she lived in the East City Villa, Gregory Song paused. He felt mixed emotions flooding him from within. The place where Debbie lived was a villa where only the richest and most powerful people of Y City resided. He had started to wonder why the girl of his dream lived somewhere so luxurious. What kind of family is she from? He thought to himself. Finally, he picked Debbie up and proceeded to the door. He hailed a taxi and gently placed the girl inside before getting in himself. What a silly girl. How bold she is to be this drunk. What if someone planned to take advantage of her state? The boy thought. He stared at her while she was leaning against him with her cheeks colored in crimson. It was as though she had blush on. His heart skipped a beat when he saw such a beautiful sight. He had been her high school classmate for 3 years, but he had never talked to her before. She was exactly his type. Her cheerful spirit and buddy character had made him completely fall in love with her. After they had taken the college entrance exam, he had thought that she would select the College of Music, if not the Institute of Physical Education. After all, she excelled at both fields. She was gifted, and she had no idea how many people she could attract with these attributes. Gregory Song, however, saw himself without talent in both. The only thing he could do for the girl he loved was cheer her on with everyone else whenever she ran in long-distance races. Indeed, that was his only idea of loving her. From a long, long distance. When Gregory knew that Debbie had applied to the economics and management school, he felt thrilled. He couldn't contain his excitement. The thought of going to the same school and being in the same class with her again made his day. During their freshman and sophomore years, they hadn't been in the same class. Luckily, the gods heard and granted his plea. They became classmates again. Suddenly, a memory flashed into his mind. Despite being one of the terrible students with terrible grades, Debbie remained excellent in his eyes. She may be a bad student, but for him, she was admirable in all other things. Thinking about this, he had always thought that she was too good for him, and he had never been confident enough to strike a conversation with her. He thought he was incapable and lacking in many ways. Even then, the same thought lingered in his mind. With this, he decided to keep his admiration to himself until he became successful enough to finally confess. These thoughts played in his mind as he occasionally glanced at her sleeping face. Half an hour later, they arrived at East City Villa. The taxi was hailed by the guards at the entrance and Gregory didn't know what to do. They didn't let them through until they saw Debbie, who was sleeping in the back seat. Frantic, he said, "Debbie, wake up. Which way should we go?" Reaching out to her, he tried to wake her up by shaking her shoulders. "Debbie?" he continued. Drunk, Debbie couldn't utter a single word, nor hear anything he just said. After a long while, with not a single response from her, Gregory told the taxi driver to wait. Opening the door and pulling her out of the taxi, he carried her and walked towards the villa she lived in. His eyes continuously wandered, as he was in awe of what he was seeing. The night was getting late and the sky became darker. The night complemented the extravagance each villa gave off. It was perfectly clear what kind of people lived in the area. He thought people who were far different from him. Knowing this, he lowered his head to look at Debbie. Many people worked so hard in their whole lives but couldn't afford such villas. Yet, she lives here? Who exactly is she? He wondered. Even then, she had been surrounded by rumors in school. However, he had never believed in any of them. Rumors such as Debbie was a mistress, that she was a lesbian, none of these he chose to believe. For him, they were nothing but nonsense. Clouded with these thoughts, he didn't notice that they had already reached their destination. As they reached her villa's porch, he tried to carry her near the door. Even before he could reach the doorbell, a limo came into a halt with flashing signals. Immediately, a distinguished-looking man in a white shirt got out of the car from the back seat, casting him cold looks. "Who is this arrogant man?" he thought, furrowing his brows. "Does he know Debbie? What is his relationship with her?" More questions popped into Gregory's head. Without taking a second glance, the man continued to head towards the villa. Gregory examined him up and down, trying to figure out who he was. The man looked familiar, he thought, but his face didn't ring a bell. His alluring posture gave him a feeling that he was someone he shouldn't associate with. On the other hand, the man walked straight towards the villa. As he was about to get in, Gregory called out hastily, "Hello, mister." Puzzled, Carlos turned his head and looked into the young man's eyes, not uttering a single word. "Good evening, mister. I know this might sound forwards, but what is your relationship with Debbie?" he asked, gathering all his courage. Thinking that he could be her brother, he asked politely. Little did he know his real relationship with Debbie. Carlos' eyes widened when he heard her name. It was only until then did he notice that the girl wrapped in his arms was his wife, Debbie. Stunned from the state she was in, "What happened to her?" he asked as he walked his way towards Gregory and Debbie. As Carlos moved towards them, immediately, Gregory felt the intimidating and arrogant aura pressing towards him. It was an aura that only older, mature men possessed. The way he walked looked even prominent for Gregory. He seems concerned for her, he thought. I must be right. He must be Debbie's brother. Carlos reached out his hand to pull her towards him. Obediently, Gregory understood and handed her to him and said, "One of our classmates threw a birthday party. She must have drunk more than she could handle." "Why drink more than you could handle?" Carlos said, pulling Debbie towards him. Now that the man was near, Gregory took a close look at him and knew that he was someone well off. As he pulled her in, a strong stench filled his nose. Carlos winced in disgust from both Debbie's smell and the sight of her wasted state. "Are you her classmate?" he suddenly asked in a deep tone, furrowing his brows. Politely, Gregory nodded and answered with a smile. Yes, I am. I should have taken good care of her. After saying this, he looked around and noticed the night getting darker. Well, brother, I should better take my leave. Have a good night then. Brother? Who is he referring to? Me? Carlos raised one of his brows, no longer bothering by what he meant. He returned a nod to the young man and carried Debbie towards the villa. As soon as he stepped inside, Debbie, who was in his arms, started to become restless. Her cheeks were crimson red, and the scent of alcohol dominated over her. At this sight, Carlos' face blackened with anger. He despised her current state. He wanted to throw her to the sofa but considered carrying her upstairs instead. He went all out and carried her to her room. The hue of Debbie's bedroom was sky blue. All her furniture was colored and tainted with sky blue. Her round bed, dressing table, closet, desk, and even her bed sheet were in sky blue color. Most importantly, the room smelled like Debbie. Slowly, he placed her in her bed and intended to leave the drunk be. As he turned around, he felt a hand grasping on his. In her drunken state, she reached out to him and held his hand by her own will, something she wouldn't do when sober. Water. I am thirsty, she murmured, wriggling her body in bed restlessly. Give me some water, she continued, looking at her indifferently. He took back his hand from her grip and left the room. Why did you drink if you knew you would end up like that? He said, walking out of the room. When he came back, Debbie was already on the floor, curling on the carpet by the bed. In his eyes, she became more hideous, gibbering, water, thirsty, water, she repeated tirelessly, turning and rolling around. He bet she would not even remember a single thing she was doing then. With brows knitted, he placed the glass of water on the nightstand and walked towards her. As he was about to pick her up and carry her into his arms, he thought, just how much did she drink? As a student, how could she get herself so drunk? I was right to decide to discipline her after all, he added. Finally, he carried her into his arms. With her arms around his neck, she pressed her head against his chest, pushing her body nearer to his. Gradually, his breathing became ragged. He couldn't understand why his heart was beating fast with their current state. Without minding too much, he put her back on the bed. With his body leaning towards her as he slowly let her go, her hands remained locked around his neck. Suddenly, she pulled him down on the bed. As much as he was surprised, his face remained firm and indifferent, trying to suppress his fast-beating heart. He stared at the tipsy girl beside him, whose eyes were closed. Her long eyelashes, rosy lips, crimson cheeks, everything on her pretty face looked tempting for him. However, he knew his own limits. Out of the blue, Debbie struggled to sit up. That night, she was never a quiet girl and continued to do things that surprised him. As she tried to sit up, her balance came off. Not only did she fail, but also dragged Carlos even closer, close enough for her to feel his breath. Coincidentally, their lips touched. At that instant, the air became awkward. Suddenly, he could no longer smell the stench from her. The tempting scent emitted from her body slowly filled his nose. The light in his eyes dimmed and the scene where he had kissed her came flooding back in his head. Back then, he had hesitated to sleep with her because they had no relationship. Now that she was his wife, it was only natural for them to spend the night together. With this thought, he lowered his head and pressed his lips on hers. The courage he had tried so hard to stop himself from doing such a thing was no longer there. He could only think of how tempting the girl beside him was. He couldn't control his desire for her. As she wriggled and moaned from his every touch, it made him more aroused. He got more and more excited, but then she suddenly stopped and became quiet. Lifting his head, he opened his eyes to look into hers, and to his disappointment, she was already fast asleep. Frustrated, he let out a deep sigh. He was still feeling hot and his face was burning up. How could she just fall asleep in that state? He thought. After a while, his face turned livid. This bloody woman must have done it purposely, he continued. Time passed, and it was Saturday the next day. Morning came, and luckily, there was no school. Knowing this, Debbie didn't leave her bed until noon and waited for the alarm to set off. As the alarm rang, she slowly woke up and turned it off. Feeling lightheaded, she rubbed her throbbing temples. Your escape into infinite tales. Suddenly, her phone rang. She fumbled in her bag to look for it and finally found her phone after a while. "Hello?" she answered. Without looking at the caller ID, she continued, "Hello? Who's this, please?" It was Jared. "Tomboy, were you still asleep?" "It's 12 o'clock already," he said. Since Debbie was never in a good mood the moment she woke up, he started to wonder if he should hang up.
12 o'clock.
"Oh, it's still so early," she replied. "Then, I should go back to sleep." Even then, she wasn't sober yet. Her voice sounded coarse. Jared felt speechless at her words. "Tomboy, it's noon. Okay?" he reminded her. Noon. She looked outside. The sun was shining high in the sky. Fine. But what does it have to do with me? She thought. The beaming light from the sun blinded her eyes. Suddenly, memories of last night hit her. Recalling how drunk she had been last night, she wondered how she had managed to come home safe and sound. "How did I get home last night?" she asked over the phone. The diverse possibilities of the answer to that question almost woke her up from her dizziness. She looked around swiftly to make sure she was in her own room. When she got a positive answer from the familiar furnishings, she could only let out a sigh of relief. "Gregory sent you home. Don't you remember?" Jared replied. "I remember him saying that he ran into your brother and handed you over to him." He continued. "Tomboy, since when do you have a brother?" "How come I didn't know that?" Jared asked in an intrigued tone. "Brother? What brother?" She thought, "I, myself, don't even know that I have one." She continued, lost in words she had just heard. Suddenly, a wild guess popped into her mind. Wait, could it be Carlos? Her mind started playing pictures of what could have happened. Could it really be him? Did Gregory meet him? She continued frantically. Thinking of the huge possibility, Debbie sat up on the bed. Did Carlos knew that I was drunk? Did that scumbag take advantage of me? In an instant, she lifted the covers and looked at herself. "Oh, thank God!" she exclaimed when she found that she was still wearing yesterday's clothes. Things from the night before were only a blur in her head. "Tomboy?" Jared asked. "Yoo-hoo, Debbie, why aren't you talking? Are you there?" Worried, he looked over the phone and saw the call was still connected. How come she is not answering? Could it be that she fell asleep again? Jared continued to wonder, not knowing the facts from last night. "Yeah, I'm here," Debbie replied on the phone. The worried lady was too distracted to pay attention to her conversation with Jared. All she wanted to know was whether she would be berated by Carlos for getting drunk. Would he punish her for it? The man, after all, had been poking his nose in everything these days. Lifting the covers off her, Debbie jumped out of the bed and said, "I'm sorry, Jar. I have to go. Talk to you later." Then she hung up the phone without waiting for Jared to reply, running to the bathroom with her head feeling as though it were being split in half. What should I do next? Revolt? Apologize? Debbie pondered in the tub. If she revolted, would she end up being buried alive? That did not sound tempting at all. So, what if she apologized instead? Would that authoritative aristocrat be merciful? Did he even know how to forgive people? The lady continued to mull over the idea and considered giving it a try. What was there to lose? Apologizing certainly felt like the easier choice. If it worked, she would no longer have to look over her shoulder anymore. Having made up her mind, she finished her bath quickly and went downstairs. Julie, who was considering going upstairs to wake her up, was glad to see her coming down. With a pleased look, the servant asked Debbie to take a seat while she brought out her lunch. At the dining table, just as she was about to take a bite of her food, an idea suddenly came to her mind. How about I cook dinner for him tonight and take it to his office myself? Maybe he'll be so touched by the gesture that he won't have any choice but to forgive me. Grinning, the girl gripped her spoon tightly and thought to herself, "That's brilliant, Deb." The idea just made more sense to her. Come to think of it, Debbie's current priority was not the divorce. but to avoid cutting her life short due to her aristocrat husband. Now that it was clear to her, she contemplated how to appease her angry husband. It was time to put the plan into action, or so she thought.
VBN. Inspiring minds, illuminating souls.
The more she thought about it, however, the more challenges crossed her mind. Debbie thought, frowning a bit. The thing is, looking down on her lap in embarrassment, she closed her eyes and bit her lip. Cooking seemed like a great idea until she realized a small hiccup which could completely influence the results. How could she overlook the key to her plan? That, in order to feed Carlos food delicious enough to make him forget his name, the first thing she needed to know was how to cook. Luckily, she just thought of the best teacher anyone could ask for. For a moment, the inexperienced chef for a day hesitated while standing in a corner. Watching Julie in her element in the kitchen, Debbie realized how fortunate she was to have someone help her accomplish her goal. At the same time, everything felt unfamiliar and yet exciting to her. The whole afternoon, sounds of clanging and banging kept coming from the kitchen. Sizzling oil flew in every direction. Up until that point, Julie never imagined that pans, plates, and ladles could be so noisy. It was as though a war were taking place in the kitchen. By the time it was 5:30 in the afternoon, the noise in the kitchen finally quieted down. To Julie's relief, the house appeared to be at peace once again. Watching Debbie put the food into a meal box, Julie could not help but wipe beads of sweat off her forehead as she prayed, "Please, let it not be poisonous. Please." When Debbie was done with packing everything, she wore a triumphant look. "That wasn't so hard now, was it?" she thought proudly. The girl put her hands on her hips and took a deep breath. It was time for the final step of her foolproof plan. Next stop, the headquarters of ZL Group. Situated in the busiest area of the city, ZL Group's astonishing 88-floor main office building towered into the sky, linked with the neighboring 66-floor skyscraper by 10-odd aerial arch bridges. Apart from ZL Group, more than 1,000 companies from all parts of the world were based there as well. Debbie had passed by the building so many times, which was one of the landmarks of Y City. Even so, had it not been for Emmett sharing the company address with her, she would not have remembered that it was where Carlos worked. As far as she knew, ZL Group had businesses in many industries such as high technology, real estate, cosmetics, clothing, and entertainment. As the boss of such a colossal group, despite his age, Carlos was highly respected. His success and competence spoke for itself. Somewhat in awe, Debbie could only imagine the pressure and responsibilities that came with his work. When she entered the building while holding the meal box, she ran into some people who had finished their work and were on their way out. The young lady wore a white shirt underneath her coat, partnered with a pair of jeans and white sneakers while her purple hair was in a bun. A single glance at her was all it took to guess that she was a college student. Her young and vigorous vibe even convinced some onlookers that she might still be in high school. Such a lovely girl did not often frequent their building, and hence, she was hard to miss. As more and more people stepped out of their offices, some of them began to wonder whom the girl was visiting there. "Excuse me, miss, how can I help you?" Rhonda Wong, who was a secretary, asked at the front desk when she noticed that Debbie was looking around like a lost child. The more mature woman warily sized her up and down. "I'm here for Carlos Huo," Debbie answered nonchalantly. As soon as that name came out of her mouth, everyone who was within earshot turned to gaze at her in bewilderment. Who is this girl? What's the nature of her relationship with boss? Nobody has dared to call him by his full name. Rhonda Wong wondered. Wherever Carlos was concerned, people addressed him as respectfully as they could. Therefore, it was always either Mr. Huo or Sir, never Carlos Huo. "Are you a fan of Mr. Huo's?" Rhonda Wong asked, her chin raised. There was a hint of contempt in her smile. Before the young university student could reply, she spoke again. "I'm sorry. Mr. Huo is very busy. I'm afraid he does not have time to meet fans today." Tens, sometimes even hundreds of people, came to see the influential man every day. But as their boss status was beyond average people's dreams, not everyone was fortunate enough to be graced with his presence. And certainly not a university student like this girl. Rhonda Wong thought to herself. I'm not his fan. Debbie was quick to answer. I'm his family. Few people were aware that she was married to Carlos. And with divorce on the table at any given moment, she did not see the point in having to disclose that information. This time, Rhonda Wong burst into laughter. Sarcasm and scorn were written all over her face, and she did not even bother to conceal them. Young girl, it's wrong to lie. Mr. Huo's family is in the US taking care of the company over there. Everybody knows it. The secretary sneered and continued. Next time you come up with a lie, be prepared. After deriding Debbie, the older woman cast an impatient glance at her and waved her hand as though she were telling her to leave. Debbie could not help but narrow her eyes at the woman. I'm not lying, she said. Why don't you just call him if you don't believe? The contempt on Rhonda Wong's face provoked Debbie, and she was not about to let it go. She thought, is everyone here so judgmental? Crossing her arms over her chest, Rhonda Wong stared at Debbie coldly and questioned, family? If you truly are Mr. Huo's family, why don't you give him a call? Despite Debbie's insistence, the secretary still did not believe her. She was, therefore, left with no choice but to find another way to convince Rhonda Wong. Gritting her teeth, Debbie dialed Philip's number. The secretary's expression shifted as she watched Debbie with a raised eyebrow. Oh, she's really calling someone. Rhonda Wong thought to herself, I wonder who it is. She better not be pulling my leg or else. As soon as Philip answered her call, Debbie said, Philip, I'm at Carlos' company right now, but there is this old lady who wouldn't let me go upstairs. Without having to look at Rhonda Wong, she could anticipate how twisted her face was at that moment when she heard Debbie call her old lady. Serves her right, Debbie thought. This was her sweet revenge for Rhonda Wong looking down on her. The moment Debbie hung up the phone, the shocked secretary bawled, Whom did you call old lady?
I am under titu.
You really need to work on your people skills, little girl. A brazen glint appeared in her eyes. You might be under 30, Debbie agreed, nodding mockingly. But the way you talk to people make you sound like you're over 40. Maybe you are lucky to work in such a big company, but it doesn't make you better than anyone else. Someone has to tell you that. It might as well be me, Debbie thought as she watched Rhonda Wong sputter an incoherent response. Blinking furiously, Rhonda Wong sneered. Didn't you call someone? Well, nothing has happened so far. From where I stand, no one cares. The moment she finished talking, however, the phone on the front desk rang. Her heart started racing nervously. Her face turned as pale as a ghost. Does she really know Mr. Huo? She thought. Scared stiff that the call might be from Carlos, she trotted to the front desk at once. When she saw the caller ID, she almost stumbled backward. Her heart jumped to her mouth. It was from the CEO's office. Throwing a glance at Debbie, she gulped upon seeing the young lady's triumphant look. It seemed she might have messed with the wrong person. Hi, Mr. Huo, she greeted, managing a nervous smile. Send her up, Carlos uttered, his voice as icy cold as ever. Although it was brief, Rhonda Wong felt a little dizzy. Her legs went numb and she could no longer move from her spot. To prevent herself from falling, she had to cling to the desk hastily. Oh my goodness! Mr. Huo has called the reception himself. He rarely does that. I'm screwed. The secretary wailed inwardly. Yes, sir, she responded, controlling her voice from being shrill. Her hands trembled as she hung up the phone. So nervous she was that she had to place the phone several times before doing it right. Then, she took a deep breath. The woman, who seemed like she was having a panic attack, repeated a breathing exercise which she knew could calm her nerves. In this industry, there was hardly room for mistakes. Yet it seemed like she might have committed a grave one. Although Debbie was standing near the front desk, it took Rhonda Wong more than 10 seconds to walk to her. Her shaking legs betrayed her calm facade, but Debbie refrained from voicing out her observation. Hello, miss. Please come with me, Rhonda Wong said in a respectable manner. All of a sudden, the atmosphere seemed to change and everything was more cheerful than it had been a few moments ago. This shift in her behavior did not go unnoticed by Debbie. but she let the secretary drown in her anxieties for a bit more and did not offer anything else but a small nod. Crap, am I going to lose my job? Rhonda Wong thought as she led Debbie to the elevator. While waiting for the elevator, she stole a glacé at the mysterious young lady who appeared to be tranquil. Rhonda Wong began, I'm so sorry. I didn't know who you are. Please, you don't need to explain. I understand. So many people come here every day asking to see Mr. Huo. Debbie interrupted her, a smile playing on her lips. The secretary seemed to have learned her lesson, so Debbie decided to stop torturing the woman with her silence. It was not her fault, after all, that she did not know her. What simple irked Debbie was that the older woman should not have looked down on people she had never met before. Her reply surprised Rhonda Wong. When people who had the luxury of meeting Carlos were offended by those beneath them, they often resorted to dishing out harsher treatments. The secretary looked at Debbie and thought, has she forgiven me so easily? I'm really sorry. I won't do that again. Rhonda Wong still apologized. For 2 years, she had been working as secretary at the front desk for ZL Group. During this long, arduous period, she had learned how to deal with problems. After carefully considering her reaction earlier, Debbie realized that she did not mean to give the secretary a hard time. So when Carlos' employee apologized to her like her life might have depended on her forgiveness, she simply nodded and said, it's okay. Which floor is his office on? Then she shrugged and added, I can go there myself. Her tone was much friendlier than earlier. It was enough to reassure Rhonda that the mysterious young lady had no intentions of having her fired from her job. She shook her head and insisted, no, Mississippi. I was instructed by Mr. Huo himself that I needed to accompany you upstairs. At ZL Group, the CEO's requests were orders that no employee dared to defy. In simple terms, whatever Carlos wanted, he would get it one way or another. Sensing the nervous tone in Rhonda's voice, Debbie could tell that she was afraid of Carlos too. That was a piece of information which did not surprise her at all. The man wore a stern expression most of the time. It would be more of a surprise if someone claimed the opposite and that Carlos could not hurt a fly. In Debbie's opinion, most people feared Carlos like Jared, and she did. Both of them, for the record, were usually hellraisers. In front of Carlos, however, they would quickly become as timid as mice. The secretary seemed determined to do her job, so Debbie nodded and followed her to the 66th floor. As much as it was spacious, the whole floor was rather quiet. Perhaps it had something to do with the fact that it was time for many employees to clock out. But Debbie sure felt like the place was as silent as a graveyard at midnight. Next to the CEO's office was a small area consisting of several desks, and on the door was a clear sign which read, Office of the CEO's Secretaries. Unlike her presumptions earlier, 5 people were still working in the office, and through the glass, she could see a 6th seat which was vacant at the moment. Took Debbie a lot of effort not to exclaim her awe. Carlos, the CEO of ZL Group, had 6 secretaries. Then it occurred to her that, as the boss of such a huge company, Carlos probably had tons of work to handle every day. It was only appropriate that he needed so many secretaries. A man wearing glasses got out of his chair and walked to them when he saw Rhonda with a lady he had yet to meet.
Unda.
This is? Although he could not put his finger on it, the man thought Debbie looked rather familiar. For someone who appeared to be in his 20s, he looked like a model student at university. With a smile lingering on his face, it was difficult to see him as anything else but a nice person. Shooting Debbie an awkward look, Rhonda turned to the man and replied courteously, Tristan, this lady is here for Mr. Huo. In spite of Rhonda's efforts to introduce the lady, Tristan was too distracted by Debbie's bewitching smile to pay attention. But soon enough, he was back to being professional. Hello, miss. Nice to meet you. Please, follow me, he said, politely gesturing with his hand towards the CEO's office. Offering a small smile, Debbie followed Tristan while Rhonda stayed behind. The young lady could tell that the older woman was relieved to pass her over to Tristan. Upon reaching the door, the male secretary knocked on the door lightly. Come in, came Carlos' deep, cold voice. Instinctively, Debbie clutched the meal box close to her. Of all the times when she could lose her nerve, It just had to be at a point when she was halfway through the final step of her plan. Would he be displeased to see her? There was a chance where Carlos would get so angry that he might grab the divorce papers and sign them at once. Then again, he could be in such a good mood that he might gladly agree to let her out of the marriage. Her mind, a little all over the place, was filled with so many questions as she walked into Carlos' office. The office was at least 300 square meters, decorated from the furniture to its walls in shades of black, white, and gray. A state-of-the-art, high-tech desk was placed by the window. In front of it were a white sofa and a glass table. Against a wall was a wine cabinet, and on the opposite side was a bookshelf with a water dispenser next to it. In spite of its enormous space, the place looked clean and simple with its minimalist style. On the left side was an indoor golf court. Some famous paintings and calligraphy were hung on the wall. Meanwhile, on the right side was the CEO's private lounge. When Carlos raised his head from what he had been working on, he saw the girl at the door. A faint light flickered in his eyes at the sight of her. Putting down the pen, he stared at Debbie, who was looking around curiously. The young lady's attention was on everything else in the room but him. When she felt his eyes on her, she paused from her subtle exploration of the room and withdrew her gaze from its decoration. After hearing Tristan close the door behind her, she took a few steps towards him. During that short moment, she tried to calm herself down. Once she did, she remarked, Carlos Huo. Immediately, she remembered Rhonda's and everyone else's reactions earlier and corrected herself. Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, sir, I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's just that, I made this at home. I'd like it if you could have a taste. Carlos raised an eyebrow in disbelief. What was she up to? Was this her way of apologizing? After their previous encounters, he had the impression that she was a very stubborn, feisty girl. She did not seem like the type to back down from a fight. Certainly not from him. So why was she apologizing to him all of a sudden? Was it all just some elaborate trick? And, well, could the girl even cook? All the questions that lingered in his mind as she stood before Carlos made him remember something from the past. The day they had registered for marriage, Carlos recalled, he had told Philip that the girl did not have to do anything, and that as his wife, she was to be treated like a queen. There was no pressure for Debbie to learn household chores or anything that required putting her hands to work. If that had been the case these past few years, then why did she feel the need to learn how to cook? Was it one of her hobbies? Because Philip had never mentioned it in his reports. For a long moment, Carlos did not say anything in response. His silence made the lady very nervous. What the hell does this mean? She thought frantically. Is he angry? Does he not want me to show up here? The possibility of her last thought made her feel a bit embarrassed. Regardless, she opened the thermal meal box anyway and said, as soon as you try everything, I will leave right away. But Carlos wasn't completely listening anymore. The moment she opened the box, a burnt smell filled the room, and hence, Carlos caught a whiff of it. Wincing, Carlos thought, what was that? Did she even check if it was edible? Debbie caught the man's expression. A frown? Why is he frowning? He has not even tasted it yet. Was it because it does not look good? She clasped her hands together and began to explain. It may look awful, but it tastes good. She's right, Carlos thought. It does look awful. Julie had tasted it and she said the same. It's really good. You should have a try. Debbie persisted. For tonight's mission, she did not even eat the dishes herself, so there would be plenty for him. Disregarding the mildly horrified look on his face, Debbie took the chopsticks out from the meal box and handed them to him. Initially, he was hesitant to accept them, but the expectant look on her face made him decide not to disappoint her. Once he did, Debbie started to introduce the dishes excitedly. This is donpa tofu. Well, this is, why is it black? It's supposed to be red braised pork. She looked at the burnt dish and giggled at Carlos. Embarrassed v epsilon b. Inspiring minds, illuminating souls. This one, she went on, pointing at another dish, is supposed to be stewed pork ball in brown sauce. How come it's black too? Her voice trailed off as she examined her cooking. The food did not seem to have looked that way earlier. Not to her anyway, due to Carlos' taste in food. His extensive experience with different cuisine prepared by brilliant chefs across the world, Debbie's dishes did not appeal to him at all. They looked so hideous that he did not have to taste them to know that the taste would not be good. Oh, I know this one. These are boiled shrimps. They didn't become black, she exclaimed excitedly. Of course, these wouldn't be black. All you needed to do was throw them in a pot and boil them, Carlos thought to himself. His hand holding the chopsticks felt like it had been tied to a stone. It was too heavy to lift, but Debbie prattled on. Carlos Huo, this is the first time I have cooked. I came here to apologize. Last night, she lowered her head. The look in the man's eyes dimmed. Her next words somehow made him feel relieved, like a thorn had been removed from his heart. I shouldn't have gotten drunk. I won't cause you any more trouble in the future. Will you forgive me? She widened her innocent eyes, putting on another expectant look while staring at Carlos. The man remained silent the entire time she talked. Finally, he nodded. Her eyes were filled with surprise and joy. Somehow, seeing her so happy made him feel happy too. At the moment, there were no words to explain the logic behind the connection. Simply put, the young lady's delight lightened up the mood in the room, and he was more than fine with it. You haven't taken a bite yet, she suddenly said. Oh, he had thought that she had forgotten about the dishes. Quite frankly, he had nearly forgotten about them himself. Among all the dishes, the shrimps were the only one that seemed like they would not give him a stomachache. So he decided to pick up a shrimp. But before his chopsticks could lift one from the meal box, she put her hand on the chopsticks and said, "Shrimps need peeling. Peeling is rather time-consuming. Better leave this one for last. Try the other dishes first." Carlos' face darkened. Dropping the shrimp and picking up a plump of red braised pork, he put it into his mouth and slowly chewed. His face froze, and as much as he tried to refrain from doing so, he still ended up spitting it out into the bin. Gosh, she calls that thing red braised pork? The shocked CEO thought. What was that taste? Hard to say. It was bitter, salty, and just weird. After wiping his mouth with a clean tissue, he grabbed the glass of water on his desk and gulped it all down. The taste was still stuck in his mouth. Puzzled, the naive young lady watched his reaction. Is it that bad? She asked genuinely. Looking into her innocent eyes, Carlos said coldly, Are you really here to apologize? Because I think you are really here to provoke me. His first suspicion earlier was right. The young lady standing before him was the same girl he had to deal with in the past, be it on the cruiser or in the club or any other time. She was the same as she had always been. How gullible of him to briefly believe that she was ever there to make amends for her mistakes. Debbie's heart was hammering while she anxiously stammered to explain herself. That's not true. My apology is sincere. I'm really sorry for offending you. Ever since Carlos moved back into the villa, he was not the mean, old womanizer he used to be. He was a changed man. He acted like a responsible adult and paid full attention to Debbie's daily needs. Debbie reminded herself all the time to stop being so headstrong with him. Perhaps if she made more of an effort to get along with him, he would get off her back. Carlos interrupted her impatiently. Enough. Now go away. You are forbidden to go into the kitchen ever again. When he finished talking, he produced a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his mouth gracefully. But why? Debbie wondered. By now, she already knew better than to anger him again. Got it. I'm sorry for disturbing your work. Debbie expelled her curiosity and answered like a good girl. After picking up the meal box, Debbie made her way to the door. Before stepping out of the office, she looked back and asked, Carlos Huo, could you sign the divorce papers? So, that's what all this was about. Just as he had anticipated, she was up to something. I knew she wouldn't just turn into this friendly, polite girl for no reason, he sneered inwardly. Now that Carlos had seen through her facade, Debbie decided to come out with the truth. Yes, it is. I just want the divorce. Why else did you think I did all of this? In truth, Debbie had been grateful to Carlos before they had a falling out. After all, he had financially supported her for 3 years. Unfortunately, Their recent unpleasant encounters had left a terrible impression on her. All the gratitude she had for him had evaporated. "I told you to ask my grandfather's permission if you want a divorce. I'll sign the papers as long as he says it's okay." Carlos' reply infuriated Debbie so much that she dashed towards his desk. But eventually, she clenched her fists to stop her temper from flaring. "How can a comatose patient give consent to anything?" she exclaimed. "That's not my problem. Now get out," he warned with a stern look on his face. Rendered speechless, Debbie turned around and walked out of the room. Carlos was filled with complex emotions even after she had closed the door behind her. Wisps of burning smell lingered the air and drifted into his nose. Feeling restless, he got up and opened the windows to let the smell out. With a cigarette in one hand, he sent for Tristan. "I want a detailed report on Debbie Nian's background. Don't leave out anything," Carlos ordered. "Debbie Nian." Tristan was puzzled. Carlos cast a cold glance at him before he took out a marriage certificate from the drawer and tossed it on the desk. Tristan picked it up to have a closer look. When he saw the photos and the names written on the side, all of a sudden, the puzzled expression on his face turned into an open-mouthed gasp. "So, the girl Mr. Huo was staring at on TV the day of the marathon and the girl who has just walked out of here is Mrs. Huo?" Tristan felt overwhelmed by curiosity. After leaving Carlos' office, Debbie got inside the BMW waiting for her in front of the office building. She sat in the back seat, unable to get a word out, looking dejected. Matan One, her driver, who was a veteran in his 50s, smiled at her through the rearview mirror. "Debbie, did Mr. Huo eat the dinner you cooked for him?" Debbie shook her head in disappointment and put the meal box aside after closing the door. Matan One tried to comfort her. "Perhaps he had already eaten dinner before you came," he said. Debbie didn't respond. Then she recalled how Carlos had reacted after he had tasted her food. She turned her sights towards the meal box, pensively wondering what made him react like that. A few moments later, she opened the box, picked up a bit of braised pork and put it in her mouth. However, as soon as the food touched her tongue, she spat it out into a tissue almost immediately. Matanwin chuckled when he understood why Carlos didn't eat her food, as he watched what the girl, who was the same age as his daughter, was doing in the back seat. "Gosh, what is this thing? Did I really cook this?" Debbie couldn't believe how bad the food tasted. Dismayed, she stared at the burnt meat in the box and finally understood why Carlos had thought that she had gone to his office just to further provoke him. As if it weren't bad enough, he might have thought she was trying to poison him. Debbie thought about how excited and nervous she had been because it was the first time she had cooked a meal for someone. She remembered the pain she had felt when drops of sizzling oil sprinkled onto her hands. Now it seemed like it had been a total waste of time. It was past 10 p.m. After Carlos had come back to the villa from work, he rubbed his stressed temples to relax himself. At the entrance, he changed into his slippers in the dim light and went upstairs. "Carlos Huo." A quiet voice suddenly came from the kitchen. Startled, he widened his eyes with fright. When he saw who it was, Carlos knitted his eyebrows as if he had just received some bad news. "Dear God, what are you doing here at this hour? Why aren't you asleep?" he scolded. Debbie sensed anger in his tone, but she didn't know why he was angry. What did I do wrong now? Did I frighten him? With that in her mind, she stifled her laughter and put on a sulky face before coming out of the kitchen with a glass of hot milk in her hand. Debbie had anticipated that Carlos would be back soon, so she had come downstairs to heat up a glass of milk for him. Coincidentally, he came back just as soon as the milk was ready. "Carlos Huo, this is for you." She handed him the glass of milk with an innocent look on her face. He glanced at her, feeling a dull ache in his head. "Why didn't you switch the lights on? She came downstairs to heat up milk for me? Could it be poisonous?" "I did. I just turned the light off before you walked in," she answered defensively. With another doubtful look at her, he thought, "She isn't reckless enough to poison me." Then he took the glass of milk from her hands and gulped it down. "Wait," she suddenly uttered. Before Debbie could even finish her sentence, Carlos rushed to the bin and spat the milk out. Debbie reached out and took the glass from his hand nervously. What she meant to tell Carlos was that the milk was too hot, but by the time she could say anything, he had already gulped it down. Carlos strode to the dining table with a black face and pulled out some tissues to wipe his mouth. Debbie tried so hard to stifle her laughter that her cheeks became as red as cherries. "You, go to sleep," Carlos commanded her. Debbie opened her mouth, hoping to mention the divorce, but after considering his bad mood, she finally decided that it might not be a good time to talk about the topic. Pursing her lips tight, she put the glass of milk on the dining table and went to her room meekly. Carlos stared at the glass of milk, then shifted his eyes towards her as she made herself scarce. After he calmed his nerves, he followed up the stairs as well. As soon as she got into her bedroom, Debbie burst into wild laughter. It was an innocent mistake, but it felt good to see the man suffer a bit. As the night deepened, Debbie turned and rolled about in bed restlessly. Multiple thoughts cascaded like a waterfall in her head. What do I have to do to get a divorce? I have tried to be defiant and failed. I have tried to please him, and that didn't work out either. That man is such a piece of work, she thought. Discover, devour, delight. The sound of the door shutting lightly came to her ears from the next room. She looked at the clock to check the time. It was 1 a.m. Does he always work so hard? What if I buy him a nice present tomorrow? Maybe he will be pleased and sign the divorce papers. Debbie was convinced that it was a good idea. She invited Christina and Casey to shop with her the next day through WeChat and finally fall asleep. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Carlos was sitting at the dining table by himself, as usual. Julie served breakfast, and assuming she wasn't needed at the table anymore, she turned to leave him alone in the dining room. "Julie," he called. "Yes, Mr. Huo." Julie responded. "Did she cook dinner on her own yesterday?" he asked.